They fired me on my birthday and laughed while doing it. And that sentence still feels unreal every time I say it out loud because it sounds like something from a bad movie, not something that happened to me in a glass conference room with cupcakes melting on the table and my name written in cheap frosting while my manager folded his hands and said, "This just isn't working out," as if he were talking about a failed date and not my life. And the thing people don't understand is that betrayal doesn't arrive screaming. It arrives smiling and polite and wrapped in corporate language. And that day, I walked into the office wearing the only red dress I owned because I told myself if I had to turn a year older, I would at least look confident and grown and valuable. And I remember thinking maybe they planned a surprise because the calendar reminder had balloons next to my name, and there was a cake, and everyone was already seated when I arrived, which never happened. Usually people drag themselves in 5 minutes late with coffee. But that day, they were all there, waiting. And I remember my stomach tightening before anyone said a word, because your body always knows before your mind catches up. And my boss cleared his throat and said, "Happy birthday," in a voice that felt practiced and empty. And someone pushed the cake toward me, but no one told me to sit. And then HR was suddenly there, which should have been my first clear sign, because HR never attended birthdays. And then my boss said, "We've decided to move in a different direction, effective immediately." And I laughed because that's what you do when reality doesn't make sense. You laugh like it's a joke you missed the punchline of. And I said, "You're firing me today?" And he nodded and said, "We felt it was best not to delay." And I looked around the room at people I had stayed late with, people I had covered for, people who had borrowed my work and called it collaboration, and none of them met my eyes. And then the words came that changed everything. He said, "The company is also moving forward with the new optimization framework." And I froze because that was my idea, the one I had pitched 3 months earlier, the one they told me was too risky, too ambitious, too theoretical, the one I spent nights refining and weekends modeling. And I said, "That's my framework." And he smiled in that thin way executives do when they think ownership is just a matter of who has the power. And he said, "Ideas belong to the company." And then someone actually laughed, not nervously, not accidentally, but openly, like this was entertainment. And I realized in that moment that they weren't just firing me, they were erasing me and repackaging my mind as their success story. And when HR slid the termination papers across the table, I noticed my hands were shaking, and I tried to stop them by pressing my palms together under the table. And I remember thinking, "Don't cry here. Don't give them that." And I signed because I wanted to leave and because the room felt smaller every second, like the walls were closing in. And when I stood up, no one clapped, no one hugged me, no one even said sorry. And the cake was still there, untouched, and my name was still written across it like a cruel joke. And as I walked out, carrying the box they give you for your things, the one that feels heavier than it should because it's full of pieces of your life, I heard my boss say, "Let's circle back to the rollout timeline." And they were already moving on, already using my work, already rewriting history. And I went to my car and sat there for a long time, staring at the steering wheel until the sun went down and the frosting on the cake inside melted completely. And I didn't cry then either, because shock is like ice. It keeps you numb long enough to survive. But later that night, alone in my apartment with the lights off and my phone buzzing with automated birthday messages from people who didn't know my world had just collapsed, I finally broke. And I cried until my chest hurt and my head throbbed. And somewhere between the tears, a thought formed, quiet but sharp. They think this is the end of me. And I didn't know then how wrong they were, because what they gave me that day wasn't just humiliation, it was clarity. And clarity is dangerous when paired with patience. And over the next weeks, as the numbness faded, something else replaced it. Not rage, not revenge, at least not yet, but a cold, focused determination. Because I started seeing everything clearly, how they had slowly pushed my name out of meetings, how my boss had started presenting my ideas without inviting me, how the credit always drifted upward and the blame always drifted down. And I realized they hadn't fired me because I was failing. They fired me because I was inconvenient, because my work was too valuable to ignore and too threatening to let me own. And once I saw that, I stopped asking what was wrong with me and started asking what I could build without them. And that question followed me through sleepless nights and cheap coffee and rejection emails and moments where I almost gave up, because rebuilding yourself after betrayal is exhausting, especially when the people who hurt you are thriving publicly with your stolen brilliance plastered across industry blogs and keynote stages. And every time I saw their logo paired with my ideas, rebranded and renamed, it felt like salt in an open wound. But it also lit a fire, because each of their successes was proof that I had been right all along, and that meant I could be right again. And this is the part of the story they never saw coming, because while they were celebrating their sudden growth and awards and headlines, I was quietly learning and planning and documenting everything. And the meeting they laughed at me in, the one they thought was forgotten, the one they thought existed only in my memory, that meeting had been recorded automatically because our company policy required it, and no one had bothered to delete it. And that file sat in a forgotten archive while 3 years passed, and seeds grew roots, and patience turned into power. And by the time they realized who I had become, it was already too late. And this is only the beginning of how the joke they laughed at became the reckoning they were forced to watch in silence. The first year after they fired me was not glamorous, and anyone who tells you revenge arcs are immediate is lying, because the truth is the beginning is lonely and humiliating and full of doubt. And I went from conference rooms with glass walls to a small rented desk in a shared workspace where the chair wobbled and the internet cut out every afternoon, and I remember thinking, this is what they reduced me to? But then I corrected myself, because no one reduces you without your permission, and I refused to give it. And I took contract work under a neutral name because I didn't want my former company tracking me, and I consulted quietly for startups who couldn't afford big firms but needed smart systems, and every project sharpened me, because now every mistake was mine, and every success was mine too. And at night, I rewrote my framework from memory, expanding it, improving it, fixing the flaws I had already seen once it was tested at scale by the very people who stole it. And yes, I watched closely because Betrayal teaches you to pay attention, and I studied their press releases and earnings calls and white papers, and I recognized my thinking in every slide, except now it was diluted, compromised, rushed, and that told me where they would fail. And I kept a notebook, not for anger, but for data. Dates, versions, names, quotes, proof, because patience isn't passive, it's active preparation. And by the second year, something shifted, because clients started referring me without knowing my past, and investors started listening without knowing my story, and the work spoke louder than any bitterness ever could. And I formed my own company quietly, choosing a name that meant renewal without revenge, because I didn't want to build something fueled by hate. I wanted something inevitable. And when I pitched, I didn't mention my old employer at all. I just talked about problems and solutions and systems and outcomes, and people leaned in, the same way they once leaned in before laughing. And this time, no one laughed. And the funding came slower than I wanted, but faster than I expected. And I hired carefully, because culture is built in small choices, and I promised myself no birthdays would ever be turned into funerals on my watch. And somewhere in the middle of all this, my former company started struggling, quietly at first, then publicly, because scaling a system you don't fully understand eventually exposes you. And they made decisions that looked smart on paper but hollow in practice, and analysts began asking questions about sustainability, and internal leaks mentioned morale issues and technical debt. And I knew exactly why, because they had taken the skeleton of my idea without the spine. And I felt something then, not joy, not pity, but a calm certainty that timing was aligning. And the third year is when the door cracked open, because an investment firm approached us about a potential acquisition pathway. And when they named the struggling company on their watch list, my heart didn't race, it slowed, because this wasn't impulse anymore. This was chess. And I didn't rush. I asked for more information, more time, more leverage. And we grew just enough to look credible but not threatening. And behind the scenes, I worked with advisors who didn't know my personal history, only my numbers and my vision. And when the opportunity finally came to bid, it wasn't dramatic. It was procedural, which is how real power moves. And the board of my old company saw us as a solution, a lifeline, a clean exit. And they never once connected my name to the girl they fired, because time changes faces and confidence changes posture, and success changes how people listen. And when the acquisition closed, the press release used words like strategic and synergistic and forward looking, and I read it without emotion because the real moment wasn't public, it was private and contractual and scheduled for the first joint leadership meeting where legacy leadership would brief the new owners. And that meeting was set for a Tuesday morning, and I noticed the date only when my assistant flagged it as important because it fell on my birthday again. 3 years to the day. And I didn't change it because symmetry matters. And when I walked into that same building, now with my own security badge and my own team behind me, the receptionist smiled the same way she always had, but this time she stood straighter. And the conference room was the same glass walls, the same long table, except now the cupcakes were gone, and the laughter was gone too. And when the former executives filed in one by one, recognition flickered across their faces, confusion, then disbelief, then something like fear, because memory has a way of waking up when power shifts. And I introduced myself calmly, no speeches, no theatrics, and I thanked them for their time. And then I said, before we discuss integration, I want to review a short piece of company history. And I nodded to my team, and the screen lit up. And there it was, the meeting, the one they thought was buried. The date stamped, the audio clear, my voice pitching the framework, their voices interrupting, dismissing, joking, and then the laugh that cut deepest echoed through the room. And no one laughed this time, because silence is heavier when it's earned. And I let it play longer than was comfortable, because discomfort was the point. And when it ended, I looked around and said, ideas belong to the company, right? And some of them flinched because words don't age well when the speaker changes. And I told them we would be restructuring leadership effective immediately, and that this review wasn't about punishment, it was about accuracy, because history matters when you're deciding who deserves to stay. And the irony wasn't lost on any of us. And as HR entered the room quietly with folders in hand, I felt no rush of victory, but a steady, grounded sense of completion, because revenge that screams is still chained to the past, but revenge that closes the circle and walks away is freedom. And as they signed their own papers under the same policy language they once used on me, I realized the meeting they laughed at had finally finished. And the room exhaled, and for the first time in 3 years, I smiled. Not because they lost, but because I had won myself back. What people expect after a story like this is fireworks, public humiliation, headlines, viral clips, executives escorted out in disgrace. But that's not how real endings work. Real endings are quieter, heavier, and far more permanent. And after that meeting, the building didn't erupt into chaos. It settled into order, because power doesn't need noise to be felt. And I didn't stay in that room to watch them gather their things, because I already knew how that felt, and I had no interest in borrowing their shame to decorate my closure. And instead, I stepped into my new office, the one with a window that faced the city, and I stood there alone for a moment, not to celebrate, but to breathe, because survival mode had finally shut off and I could feel it in my body, like unclenching a fist you've held tight for years. And the first decision I made as owner wasn't about revenge. It was about repair, because cultures rot from the top. And if I wanted the company to live, I had to excise what poisoned it and then rebuild what fear had hollowed out. And over the next weeks, leadership changed, processes changed, credit lines changed, and something subtle but powerful happened. People started speaking again. Ideas surfaced that had been buried. People took risks without whispering. And one afternoon, a junior analyst knocked on my door, nervous and honest, and said she'd heard what happened years ago and asked if it was true. And I told her the truth. Not the dramatic version, not the legend, just the facts. And she said, "Thank you for not becoming like them." And that was the moment I understood the real return on investment. Because success isn't proving them wrong, it's proving you didn't need to become cruel to become powerful. And on my birthday that year, I left the office early and went somewhere quiet, and I bought myself a small cake. Nothing fancy, no names written on it, and I ate it slowly, without a meeting, without witnesses, without laughter, and it tasted better than any revenge fantasy ever could, because it was mine. And the company grew, not explosively, but sustainably. And my framework finally lived the way it was meant to: flexible, ethical, resilient. And sometimes I'd see one of them years later at an industry event, not as enemies, not as ghosts, just as people who made a choice and lived with its echo. And they'd nod politely, and I'd nod back. Because closure doesn't require forgiveness, it requires distance and understanding. And if there's anything I want people to take from this story, it's this: when someone steals your work, laughs at your voice, and fires you to erase you, they aren't ending your story. They're freeing it. And the best revenge isn't watching them fall. It's building something so solid that even when you look back, you don't want to go back. And I never replayed that meeting again because I didn't need to. The lesson had already been learned by everyone in the room, including me. And that's where my story ends. Not with applause, not with anger, but with ownership of my work, my time, and my name. And that is the kind of ending no one can ever take from you again.